from back in the day. And then you move back here. After that work. Okay, so I thought I would do that. This is the most recent paper I have, so it's about the US and China. It's not about stabilization. It's not about Argentina. The bomb going on, I think. So a little bit of a break from all of that. Okay, so trade liberalization and labor market outcomes, and I should say it's joint work with Justin Pierce, who I've done a bunch of work on U.S.-China trade, and an old student of mine, Christina Telachula, who's at the Census Bureau. Okay, so we're going to be using U.S. Census data, so there's a usual disclaimer. All right, so what's the motivation for this paper? So there's a China shock hit the United States, and there's been a lot written about the China shock. I've done some work, and then the famous papers in this are Order, Hansen, and various combinations of Order, Hansen. So if you step back a little bit, before the China shock, there's a lot of work on labor market shocks in general, and how to figure out the impact of those shocks on workers in various ways, employment and earnings in particular, but also things like socioeconomic outcomes, movement, migration, etc. So there's a lot of papers in that area. And then in particular in that area, there's the China shock. And the link between U.S. trade liberalization with China, which I'll talk more about, and the decline in manufacturing employment that Juan Carlos mentioned, that's pretty well established. But what's not as well established is what happens to earnings, and also not as well established is what happens outside manufacturing. And so the goal of this paper is to look in particular at earnings and also outcomes both within and outside manufacturing. But beyond that, I've sat through many kind of talks and read a lot of papers about the China shock in the US, and the view that you get from those papers is almost always negative. Trade with China increased, and US manufacturing employment fell, and US manufacturing workers were hit, and it's bad. And that's a little surprising if you're a trade economist, because you expect there to be some good showing up somewhere as the US, as a country reallocates towards competitive advantage. So when we started this paper, we also had in our minds, why is it that finding some kind of pro-competitive effect has been so elusive? Why has that been so difficult? Okay. So we're going to relook at the China shock, and I'll explain the change in policy. And what's going to allow us to potentially have some new answers to these questions is usually the case in empirical work, is using more detailed data. And in particular, in this paper, we're going to take advantage of being able to look at things at the worker level. So in the United States, there's a data set that matches the employers and employees. It's called the LEHD, Longitudinal Household Employment Database. And so we're going to be able to look, in contrast to most of the China shock research, which takes place either at the regional level or sometimes at the firm level, but very rarely at the worker level, we'll be able to do things at the worker level. And that's attractive for several reasons. One reason is when we look at the worker level, we can control for worker attributes. If you do the regional level, county level, or commuting zone level, you have limited ability to control for the things to the extent that they're not uniform across the different regions that you're looking at. And another attractive feature is it covers, in principle, all U.S. workers. So we can look both at manufacturing workers, who we know had a certain set of outcomes, and non-manufacturing workers. And another reason it's attractive is that we can think about two different levels of exposure. So in most of the China shock literature, the exposure is in fact regional. They ask whether the Arctic instrument kind of way, whether or not the region that you are employed in, how that's been exposed to China. Here, we can look at your regional exposure, and we can also look at the exposure in your industry. And that maps, if you think about the theoretical literature on labor market shocks, that can map back into the two kinds of frictions that might be fairly important. So spatial exposure, to the extent we find something relevant for spatial exposure, it suggests there's spatial frictions. Workers, for one reason, are not moving to areas where the shock isn't so bad. The industry exposure talks about sectoral frictions, whether you can change industries. And the key thing that we're going to find here is that spatial exposure is most relevant when we run a horse race. Okay, so specifically, what questions we want to address? What's the relative impact of county exposure versus industry exposure? How are you affected if you begin, when the shock hits, if you begin in manufacturing versus being outside manufacturing? And then another thing we can look at is exposure along the supply chain, if you will. So a worker could be in a region in an industry where that region or industry is directly affected by what they produce. But the pro-competitive effect might come in if you think about exposure upstream. So conditional on my own exposure, if the industries that sell to me are exposed, that might be good for me because one way or another, I might inherit lower input costs or some kind of productivity improvement. And then downstream exposure, well, that could be like my own exposure. That could be even add to the negative impact of the shock because if the industries I sell to or the counties that we sell to are our customers and they get shocked, then they'll go away potentially. Okay. So really, if you want to think about it in a nutshell, what are we trying to do? And in particular, if we think about the pro-competitive effects, that question, it's really trying to, by using individual level data, broaden our ability to think about exposure, both upstream versus downstream and known, and then in your county versus your industry. Good? Okay, stop me if it's not good. All right, so what are we going to find? Well, that's not surprising. So and I'm going to use M, rather than write out manufacturing and non-manufacturing all the time, I'm just going to call M manufacturing, and M is non-manufacturing. So manufacturing workers, they exhibit substantial losses in relative earnings. Everything I'm going to do is a different diff. So everything is relative. I can't say anything about the levels, right? So relatively speaking, manufacturing workers, as we knew already, don't fare well. We find that county exposure matters more than industry exposure, and I'm particularly interested in what you think about those results because, why would it be that the county you're in matters more than the industry? And well, okay, there's some kind of movement friction, but it could operate through one of two different basic channels. It could be that if you're in a county that gets hit by the shock, then a lot of workers get displaced, and then the competition for whatever jobs are left, so on the labor market side, that could drive down earnings. It could also be that if you're in a county that gets exposed and workers get displaced, aggregate income falls, and then demand for other things remaining in that county will go down. And I don't think we figured out any really clever way to distinguish neatly between those two, but we're kind of intensely interested in trying to figure something like that out, at least empirically. Okay. And then what we find is upstream exposure, actually in this paper, when we use individual level data, in comparison to papers that have tried to do things at the industry level or at the county level, we find that upstream exposure does lead to relative benefits in terms of earnings outcomes. And that is true for both manufacturing and non-manufacturing. But what's really interesting is that that's especially true for non-manufacturing workers. So what is that saying? If you're a non-manufacturing worker and you've been exposed and you have high upstream exposure, actually overcomes the negative effect of downstream exposure. Non-manufacturing workers have no own exposure, so that actually is a typo. Sorry about that. So what would be an example? Just so you have this example in mind as I go along. Think about something like the hospital sector. Hospitals use a lot of goods, right? Needles, syringes, etc. China shock upstream could reduce the cost of those inputs. Your downstream exposure is almost zero because your customers are the people that live around the hospital, and your supply, you can't move offshore with the hospital and provide those medical services from someplace else. So the hospital sector has pretty high upstream exposure and pretty low downstream exposure, and that's a service industry where the upstream exposure particularly overcomes the downstream exposure, and there's a relative gain. Right? And it's interesting, and I'll give you more examples as we go along, to think about sectors both within manufacturing and outside manufacturing, that have that variation in upstream versus downstream.
And the exposure to your own like hospitals, how do you got it?
Yeah, so this is actually a typo because for non-manufacturing workers, you'll see in a minute the way I define it, there is no own exposure because since you're a non-tradable, you don't show up in the tariff code. Yeah. Yes.
All the benefits and losses are estimated in terms of relative earnings.
Yes.
That's
the thing we're going to focus on. And we can also, so in this version, you'll see in a minute, I'll say more about this, but in this paper, we're focusing on earnings. You could also think about the employment outcome as being a variable. Those are the things we see best in these data. But other things we could look at, but haven't disclosed yet, are things like whether you move region, whether you move plant, whether you move firm. So we haven't played much around those things. So today I'm going to focus on.
You can follow the workers.
I can follow the workers. We can ask also, I mean, one way we thought we might be able to get at the labor market competition versus aggregate income story was we can see where manufacturing workers go. So I'm going to give you some descriptive evidence about that today, which I think is kind of cool. But we haven't yet formally looked at those in the regressions. Yeah.
So you're assuming there's only a China shock on manufacturing, but there's no China shock on services. Say Apple exporting services to China, since now you're taking production to China.
So two ways to answer your question. One is if you're a non-manufacturing sector, you could be exposed upstream or downstream. So we have that, right? What we might be missing, although it's interesting to think about how we might be missing it. We might be missing the idea that, so if you're Apple and you're thinking about making an iPhone, right, that would be in principle upstream to you. So if you thought about Apple actually in the period we're studying is no longer a manufacturing firm. It's purely a wholesale retail operation. And it's mostly retail because they have all the stores, which dominate the number of employees they have in Cupertino. But they do have, the thing we're not quite getting right is that China opens up opportunities for tech firms to come into existence that wouldn't have been possible before. So I agree that we're missing something. It's hard to figure out. We have other papers where we're trying to figure out how to deal with that, but that's a tricky thing. So if you believe that's strong, we're kind of underestimating, I think, the gains outside. Yeah. But I'm interested in any thoughts you have about how we might get to it. Okay. Good. Is that all? We're all good on. Okay, that's the main findings. Lots and lots of work. To call attention to. So I'm not going to go through this so much. There's work on mass layoffs in that literature. They want to know what knocks you out of your job. They have a hard time finding really good events that knock people out that are exogenous. And so they invent, actually the Jacobs and Lalonde paper, the first one is really nice. They invent this idea of mass layoff. They look at what happens to workers when a very large share of workers in an establishment get let go. They just think about that as being an exogenous shock. Okay, but in this case, what we have with respect to that literature is we have this arguably exogenous trade policy shock, which we can take advantage of. Then there's the work on the frictions, lots of work on import shocks, and then there's particular work on the China shock. And then I made the next few slides mostly for me. I don't know whether the next few slides are good for you. I'm going to show them to you anyway because I'm still working through the best way to describe the next few stuff. The message I want to convey is the China shock literature takes place at different levels. Okay, so there's some papers, and I made it as a 2x2. So some papers look at manufacturing, some papers look at outside manufacturing, some papers look at both. Most of them actually, if do non-manufacturing, look at both. And then some look at employment, some look at wages, and then there's a bunch of others that you put down here that look at other outcomes. Like we have a paper that looks at mortality. Okay. And then different teams have participated in different ways in these in this literature. So I'm summarizing them with acronyms. I can always tell you what they are, but anything that starts with A is usually R and some others. And then this is just a paper I have with Justin, and BHKL is a more recent paper by Bloom, Handley and all, and they're replicating the ADH stuff using census data. And so there's pretty good agreement in the cell manufacturing employment that is exposure leads to declining manufacturing employment. Okay, and that's pretty much everywhere you look. But if you look outside manufacturing, the message isn't as clear. So the Odedorn and Hansen paper finds no employment effect in non-manufacturing But in fact, they do find a wage effect, and then they find the opposite in the manufacturing sector. So there's kind of inconsistencies, things that just, that are hard to reconcile. And our impression is that might be because you're looking at regional level data as opposed to individual level data. So these results are mixed. And then if you go look at wages and/or earnings, the wage results are mixed. So, like for example, the Order Hansen paper finds no impact on wages in manufacturing, even though they find a big employment effect. There's no employment effect in Order and Hansen in non-manufacturing, but there is a big wage. So another motivation for this, maybe it's not as interesting, maybe it is to kind of try to figure out, like, I'm going to take another data set, and see what we find relative to what the literature has found so far. And I don't know if that's the best way to summarize it. There's lots of different papers, and we've been trying to figure out how to classify them. So anyway, additional motivation relative to what's been found before. Good. Okay. Okay. Another thing that's interesting about the papers that are out there, especially the more recent Bloom, Hanley, I forget now who the other two are, paper, is relative to some of the papers in literature. They focus on, they also focus on regions, but what they call attention to is heterogeneity in the regions in terms of their capital labor ratios. And they find that the outcomes of regions outside manufacturing, to some extent within, but mostly outside manufacturing, vary according to the endowments of those regions. And they have in mind kind of what you were asking, like a more capital-intensive region versus a more labor-intensive region might somehow be able to take advantage of the China shock in ways that the other kinds of regions can. And we haven't yet actually looked at them in our region stuff in terms of endowments, but I think one of the things that explains this is not so much the skill intensity of the region, but go back to the example I told you, it's the mix of non-tradable industries that are in those regions and their upstream exposure versus downstream exposure. So we know that those are we know already that those are what I'm going to tell you about exposure, and what they tell you about the regions is correlated, but we haven't yet gone back to very closely examine that correlation and find out if there's something left over about our story if you use their story, or something left over about their story if you use our story. But my impression so far from the data is that it's mostly about exposure and not so much about the capital intensity. Depends what you want to think of as the fundamental driver. Regions, composition, and stuff. Okay. Good. All right. So, enough motivation. Off we go. Data. So as I said, we're gonna be focusing on the LEHD. What is the LEHD? So the LEHD is a national data set, but it comes up from the states in the United States. So every state has its own unemployment insurance program, and that unemployment insurance program keeps track using administrative tax data, keeps track of all the employees of all the firms in the state. And so every month they keep track of who's employed, and they will know if somebody that was employed then doesn't show up another month when they're not employed. But what you don't know from those data are whether they're unemployed or whether they've left the labor force, because that determination comes from a different set than the administrative data. So you'll see, I'm going to use throughout the presentation, one of the states where the median is not employed, but I don't know whether that's unemployed or out of the labor force. Okay, so the states all give the data up, they pass it up to the federal government packages it together in a way that's very useful for researchers. What kind of packaging goes on? Well, they give a unique identifier to every worker. That unique identifier for the worker can be matched to an establishment level identifier in the state. That's often a fuzzy match, it's difficult to do, so the LHD gives you like a best match. Then you can match that establishment identifier of the worker to something called the LBD in another census data set, which maps establishments to firms. So now you can link the worker to an establishment. The establishment gives you the industry that the worker's in. You already know the state and county that the worker's in from the unemployment insurance. You match it to a firm. Now you can do things like know the size of the firm that the worker works at, whether the firm trades, etc. And you can also match the identifier that the census puts in the LEHD to other census information, in particular the long form of the census. And so for the workers that show up in the long form, you know their education levels, et cetera, from the 10-year censuses that get done. And for the other workers, they do the magic of imputation, and they tell you those things. So we're going to take it. What does this mean for us? What means is that we have a bunch of demographic and firm level information that we can use as controls. So that's nice because we can take care of those, sweep out whatever effect is associated with those variables. And it also means, although I won't be able to present it to you today, it means we can look at whether or not the effects we find vary across demographic groups. So for example, one thing we're looking into is whether females versus males are more or less affected inside versus outside demographic. But those aren't disclosed yet. So, the paragraph's like almost written in the draft. Right? So it exists in a kind of super state in my computer, but isn't yet ready in the slides. Okay. I'll come back to this when I tell you more about it. And so anyway, we're going to do all kinds of, we can control for all this kind of stuff, and we could potentially also look for heterogeneous effects. And then, I already said this, but you can map the firm level identifiers in this thing, and this tells you whether firms are traders. And so another thing you can ask is, you can control for whether the worker works at a firm that already was a trading firm. And you can also look at heterogeneous effects. So workers that work for firms that were already importing have higher or lower outcomes than ones that work for non-trading firms. Okay, good on data.
Do you have any information of API?
We might. What do you want to know?
Whether there's Chinese API as well, like Chinese firms buy sort of managed firms.
And do you have you think of which way that might go?
Well, I mean, if that's correlated with Chinese imports as well, and you may think there's some like change in other things that, well, so that wouldn't be capturing how firm fixed effects without a change in, say, management of the firm. Something like that.
Yeah, so we are gonna, we'll have worker fixed effects in the regressions. I suppose, yeah, you made me think of two things. So we potentially either with more effort, we can learn more about which firms might be multinationals. So there's like an easy flag one can use. We haven't taken advantage of that. I think there might be another way with a data set that's not yet linked to what we're using for that you could tell whether the firm has an establishment in China or has any kind of link. That might be interesting, actually. And my impression is a lot of the FDI that China engages in the US happens kind of after the period we're looking at. So that might be interesting, too.
No, you're right. So this ends in 2014.
Yeah, but I mean, so the main thing we're going to look at is 93 to 2000 versus 2000 to 2014. But it might be interesting to actually then trace out just descriptively what happens to workers who work at firms that then change ownership. That might be kind of cool. Yeah, so we do have to do a bit more work to do that, but that might be interesting. I mean, there's already a paper in the China Shock canon that shows that most of the employment loss is actually happening at multinationals, whether they're US-based multinationals or US-owned multinationals. But that's not that surprising because it's the big firms that are shedding employment. Although there's another paper, Teresa Ford has a paper looking at, even though those multinationals are closing down plants in the US and shedding employment, they don't go to zero, even if they have many plants as well. But yeah, I agree with you. Good. Okay. All right. So this is important. So the LEHD is great, but like every great data set, it has its flaws. And one of the flaws of the LEHD is that it becomes increasingly available in terms of states over time. So if you want to start in 2000, you can work with 46 states, which is pretty good, right? Out of 50. If you want to go back to 93, which we need to do to have a pre-period, there are only 19 states in 1993. So we're going to give you, I'm going to show you results from two different samples. If I show you stuff that's only after 2000, that's using all 46 states, and that'll be a lot of the descriptive stuff that I showed you. And then when I do the regressions, it'll be based on that 19-state sample. It doesn't look via various ways of checking that this 19-state sample is that much worse than the 46 sample in terms of the observables, but it's something to be kept. Okay. Another way it might be have to keep it in mind that you may not at first realize is, remember, a worker in the LAHE can disappear. And if you're looking at all 50 states, that means that the worker's not employed. But if you're only looking at 19 states, it's possible that the worker moved to a state that wasn't covered. Even in the 50 state sample, it's possible the worker moves to a country. Yeah. Anyway, we have some ideas about how to deal with that. We just haven't done it yet. Okay, those are the data. So now let me give you some descriptive stuff. Right? I'm doing this just because it's interesting and it relates to some of the speculation that's gone on in the China shock literature, some of the speculation about what happened to manufacturing workers. A lot of that speculation is speculation because you didn't have the LAHD to do what I'm about to show you. So it's in that spirit that these next data are presented. I also think of the descriptive work I'm going to show you now as setting up the regression analysis. So first, a big picture view, in case you're not already familiar with it. So this is the post-war period in the United States, 1950 to 2022. The lighter line is manufacturing employment in levels. Manufacturing employment hits a peak in 1979 at 19.5 million workers. There's this growth in the post-war period. This is Great Society, kind of emerging from World War II, military, industrial complex stuff. Then from 1979 to 2000, there's a loss of about 3 million manufacturing jobs. And then in 2000, there's this just drastic drop in manufacturing employment, and there's as many jobs lost in about 2-3 years here as there were over the previous 20. So one thing that's really interesting and unfortunate about the China shock is that it was very fast. The decline was very fast, and showing you the history kind of drives that point home. Another thing that was really interesting about the China shock was there was almost no recovery before the Great Recession. Okay. Another thing that you don't see in this figure so much, but which is not hard to show you, is that that decline was geographically concentrated. So you might think that there could be labor market shocks that, like ChatGPT 3 or 4, that will operate economy-wide, but this didn't operate economy-wide. This knocked out certain workers, and I think if you think through why the spatial results we find might be so strong, they knocked out workers who were in regions where the opportunities that were available for other things to do were rather limited. And so that's one of the explanations, I think, for the results that we find. Okay, and then you can see even after the Great Recession, there's some recovery in manufacturing employment, but it's unlikely we're ever going to get anywhere near that. This is when I graduated at grad school. And then my first few years at Yale, just watching this go down and having this debate with my advisor about whether this was going to come back or not. He was thinking, oh, it'll come back. Okay, so I puzzled over this figure for many years. All right, and then what's the dark line? The dark line is non-manufacturing employment. And you can see that keeps growing, right? Hence a COVID shock, but still that keeps growing. There are different scales, so it's hard to show, but although there's kind of a dip here, it's nowhere near as important proportionally as it is. Good. Okay, so that sets the stage. Ooh. So where did all these guys go? I've been wanting to answer this question for a long time, and it's hard to. I mean, there's some publicly available data sets where you can, there's a job LAHD extract tool that you can get on the web, but it only allows you to trace workers from one quarter to the next. What we kind of want to do is what happens over that 7-year period between this thing in 2000 and 2007, right before the Great Recession. If you look over that long period of time, what happened to those workers? And in the U.S. at least, there's a lot of discussion. They all went, depending on where you are on the political spectrum, sometimes the emphasis gets put on one of two places. One is that those workers all were forced out of really good paying manufacturing jobs, and they all had to go work for McDonald's or something. And so their wages multiplied. And so, and then there's other studies that kind of point to the idea that, well, no, maybe manufacturing workers were just fine. At the same time that manufacturing fell, construction was booming. And so the skill overlap between construction and manufacturing is not so bad. So probably what happened was the booming construction sector alleviated some of the pain that might have happened from being displaced from manufacturing. But there's been no decomposition of where workers have gone, and so that's what the next couple slides are supposed to answer.
And is it classified according to where the workers work, so for, or what are the tasks?
Unfortunately, in the LHD, there's no task occupation information, so I'll come back to that.
Firm renovation.
It's establishment. So yeah, think about a firm as a potential collection of establishments. Many manufacturing firms are actually single unit, but all the value and most of the employment is the multiple units. Yeah. And so, I mean, one of the things we'll look at later is whether or not your outcome depended on whether you worked for a diversified manufacturing firm or a non-diversified, where we ask objectively. Okay, so first, just a simple table. Okay, this is the 46 state sample, right? So this is the sample we're starting in 2000, so I can use almost all states. You can be one of three conditions in 2000. You could be a non-manufacturing NM, you could be in manufacturing, or you could be not employed, where we don't know if you're out of labor force or not. And then you could have a similar state in 2007, so very simple decomposition. And what do you see? So first thing you see is, well, let's look at the net numbers. This is just the same numbers I showed you on the figure a minute ago. There were 17.5 million workers in manufacturing in 2000, and that went down by about 3 million in 2007. So that's the net decline in manufacturing employment. What does seem interesting, and I don't know, mildly surprising to us, is that, okay, even though there's that big net decline, it's still a very vibrant sector. There's millions of workers moving into manufacturing, and there's millions of workers moving out. Of course, there's more moving out than are moving in, but still, you have large growth flows. Okay. What else? Then you can look at the growth flows as well to non-employment, right? And again, since there's more workers going from manufacturing to non-employment than there are in the other direction, but they are going in the direction. So there were workers who were not employed in 2000, and they come in by 2007. Okay, so lots of gross churning going on. And now what I want to do is focus on, all right, so of the 17.5 million manufacturing workers that were in manufacturing in 2000, 4 went to non-employment, right? A bunch, the biggest chunk stayed in manufacturing. And then there was this almost 6 million gross flow out of manufacturing. So everything I'm going to show you now is, where did those gross flows go? I would prefer to show you both the gross flows and the net flows, but I can't, because I didn't disclose the net flows. So the net flows, I promise you that at some point in the future. I don't think, I have to say this conditionally because I can't tell you anything I'm not disclosed, but I don't expect it to change the message much. Okay? But so one thing, I'm going to just take that 5.7 million, show you a bar graph where they all go. Okay, so 45% of manufacturing workers in 2000 stay, 23% go to non-employment, and I'm going to focus in this table on the rest of them. So where do they go? And I'm sorting them in a way that will be obvious in a minute. More or less, I'm sorting them by the flow, but you'll see in a minute why it doesn't line up perfectly. And so I'm doing this by 2-digit NAICS category. So U.S. industries are classified by 6-digit NAICS codes. Every establishment that a worker works at has a 6-digit NAICS code. That's how I know the industry where the worker works. So I'm just showing you the first two digits of those things just to give you ideas. But we can do this at the 6-digit level. We just could never disclose it because there's too many numbers to disclose. Okay, so what do you see? We don't see occupation, but what two things that jump out at you are that a big chunk of manufacturing workers move to NAICS 54, which is professional services, and NAICS 42, which is wholesale. So why would that be? What is professional services? So the 54s are all the really cool sectors. R&D labs, engineering, marketing, accounting, law, all those services, which could be standalone services, but might also be part of a manufacturing firm, especially a big manufacturing firm that has a headquarters. Think about GE. They have R&D labs for Boeing, and they have headquarters, and they have wholesale, and their transportation subsidiaries. So this movement could be, and then also a bunch move into wholesale. So what's wholesale, right? We know what wholesale is, right? Selling to other businesses. And manufacturing firms, as firms, often have wholesale establishments. But in both these cases, what's interesting is that from other work we've been doing, if you look at the evolution of manufacturing firms over this period, some of them dropped, like Apple, all their manufacturing. Apple did that earlier. But some of them drop their manufacturing establishments and they become non-manufacturing firms. But they're still, in a way, you want to think about them as like manufacturing firms because they're still coordinating the production of a physical good. They've just either sent offshore or outsourced the physical manipulation that is the product. And that could be, in Apple's case, it's a manifestation of the fact that the services embedded in the product are really where the value of the iPhone is. It's not so much the iPhone itself. Okay, so this could represent structural change. Some firms are changing. So the worker could have stayed kind of at the same firm, but moved into an establishment that had a different code. Or it could be just what you suggested, which is, you were an accountant, you just happened to work in a relatively big manufacturing facility where you were, you did some kind of wholesaling operation, and then when your manufacturing firm went out of business, you just moved, you jumped industry, but you didn't jump. We can't tell the difference between those two.
It could also be the case that some manufacturing firms were outsourcing services activities to specialized services firms. Could also explain a part of these movements. I'm not talking about outsourcing offshore, but outsourcing at home.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean these bars, I don't think these bars would catch that because the definition here is that you started in 2000, you started at an establishment that was coded with anybody, right? And then you left. So it could be, like for your story, it could be, look, maybe they had a couple engineers in the manufacturing establishment, and they also hired an engineering firm. And then because of the decline, everything went to the engineering firm, they dropped it. So that worker then kind of moved to the engineering firm. Yeah.
So you cannot put establishment within firms.
Sorry?
You cannot identify the firm of the establishment.
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Oh.
So I could do the same thing here. I could do the gross flows depending upon the industry code of the firm. But I don't find that very satisfying because how do you some people use like the main industry of the firm. But
but you can say within professionals, before you can see which ones change firms and which ones.
Yeah. I haven't yet, but I mean, inside census, we've broken this out by did you change your establishment or not? Did you change your firm or not? Did you change your county or not? Right? Yeah, so we can do that. And so a future version will have those. Yeah. Okay, so that's one thing that's interesting. Again, along the lines of another really interesting sector, if you know your NAICS as well, is 56. So 56 is called Administrative Support and Waste, which doesn't at first sound interesting, but most of everything that goes on in 56 is temp agencies, staffing agencies. And there's been a lot of speculation in the literature that what's happened is, manufacturing firms have outsourced within the United States, maybe not offshore, some of the more routine tasks that they would have to do. And so you can see that a pretty popular destination is 56. So that gives some support to that idea that that's been happening. And then here's construction. So Kerwin Charles and co-authors first, they have a paper when they discuss the decline of manufacturing, and they speculate what I told you earlier, which is workers might have fled to construction. But here you see that it's a sizable number of workers. It's about 500,000 workers, or about 3% of the flow, go to construction, but it's by no means dominant, right? Most of the allocated allocation is not going to construction. All right, so I think this is kind of, then where else do they go? Retail, whatever. So let's take this and do this. So this figure is the gross flows across all the counties that are in the 46 state sample. And then this figure is the same thing, except what I'm going to do is break the flows into whether you began in a county that had high exposure versus a county that had low exposure. Okay, so this is kind of setting up where we're going with regression analysis. And I just want to answer the question was, well, this is where they go overall. Where do they go maybe if they were exposed to China, right? If you kind of believe our identification strategy. So the darker bars are the low exposure, and the lighter bars are the high exposure. So if you think about this professional, like health, wholesale, right? Those are more likely, those flows were larger in the less exposed areas, right? So there's this reallocation, at least in terms of these gross flows, not overall reallocation, but there's this reallocation to these gross flows towards those service sectors. And then in terms in the high exposure area, they're more likely to move into health. Again, just being descriptive here. And then you can also look at where, it's about roughly even, as opposed to whether you were in a high exposed or low exposed area when you started moving into the sector that has temp agencies. Right? A little bit less for the high exposure area, but lower for the low exposure area. So again, as I said in the regressions, I'm not going to be doing anything today about outcomes other than earnings. But one of the things we can add to what I'm going to show you later is kind of a more formal way of looking at these flows. Okay? But more interesting, I think, than looking at the flows now is to think about the median change in earnings behind these flows. Right? Because again, one of the stories is like workers left manufacturing and they went to McDonald's, so their wages were like terrible outcomes.
The mechanical explanation could be related to differences in turnover, regular turnover across industries, right? Suppose the turnover of workers within an industry, like gross flows relative to
like retail is very high turnover, manufacturing is low.
Exactly.
Right.
So wouldn't it have different this kind of prediction? That there is a way of accommodating. This explanation could explain mechanically why kind of in low exposure would be the regular effect of say turnover. People, yes, you go from one industry to the other.
Right.
But when there is a shock, these some are fast to absorb, the others are.
So you're not just okay. So you're talking about the drivers of turnover. So imagine retail, they'll take a chance on anybody. But in construction, you have to demonstrate yourself, and so there's higher turnover in retail and lower turnover in construction. And but they're all starting from the same sector. So maybe, I don't know. I guess you need to know. You could invert this and say that's turnover, or you could ask what's the turnover and then see if the flows are consistent with that. Yeah. I guess that's plausible. I guess before that, I would go with this idea of like the affinity between the skill set in some way between different things. Okay. All right. So I'm going to show you the same two graphs I showed you a minute ago, but now for earnings. I'll define that in a second. So the one on the left, this one, is all counties, and here I'm going to break it out by exposure. Okay, so what do? So for every worker starting in manufacturing, we know where they went in gross flows. Some stayed in manufacturing, that's the red bar. And then everybody else went someplace else. So what I do is for every pair of cells, manufacturing destination, I see all the workers. I see the nominal change in earnings of all the workers in every pair of cells. And then I'm going to show you the median. Okay? So if you look at the manufacturing one, this says that if you stayed in manufacturing, your wage growth was like 30%. I think it's 33%. And it's over 7 years, it's 28%. It's over 7 years, it works out to about 3.5% a year, which seems about right in terms of like what nominal wage growth might be. Okay? So if you think about that as like the benchmark, a benchmark, then you can say, well, what happens if you go to other sectors and now I've sorted them by this wage, right? Sorted them by this median change in earnings. And you can see if you went into the 56, that's the temp agencies, yeah, that dropped a lot, right, in nominal terms. Same is true if you look at things like hotels and restaurants and retail, right? Those are all either zero or negative in nominal terms. And then where do they get higher? They get higher if you're about the same if you're in wholesale or professional, maybe a little bit bigger. And then the really big one is mining, and that makes sense because there's a mining, resource boom in the U.S. Then you do the same exercise by high and low exposure, and you see two things over here on this side, right? So the first thing is in every destination, the nominal earnings growth is lower. Okay? And then in particular, it's negative in nominal terms, which is pretty extreme over 7 years in those kind of less skill intensive, what we think of as like the McDonald's story, go work in Walmart story. Okay. Okay. So then this, we're thinking of this is again just descriptive, but this is, you can think of this as the template for what we're going to do now. So in the regression analysis, what we want to do We want to compare the outcomes of workers before the China shock over some period of time. I'll define the China shock for you and tell you why it's in 2000 versus afterwards. So standard different diff, we're just going to be asking whether there's any change, and we're looking for pretrends, all that kind of stuff. And in this case, what we can do is we can control, again, for a very rich set of worker characteristics, we can allow those worker characteristics to break at the same time as the change in policy, which gives us even kind of a better ability, I think, to catch the effect of the change in policy. Okay, good. All right. So, what are we doing? Doing well. All right, so what's the change in policy? I don't know how familiar you are with China shock stuff, but there's kind of these two different ways of looking at it. There's the Odor Hansen story, and they look at outcomes kind of over 2 different decades. And their motivation is mostly that China emerged as a kind of more productive economy over time, and that led to their ability to control world markets. But if you go back to that figure I showed you about employment, it's very sharp at 2000 something happens, right? And so the question was like, why would it be so sharp at 2000? Not like all of a sudden China became productive. So, China joined the WTO, but what about joining the WTO was relevant? And actually, I think the change in policy itself here is quite interesting. So, what is the change in policy? It's known as permanent normal trade relations. And so what was PNTR, permanent normal trade relations, and what did it displace? So China was really not relevant in international markets when it first emerged on the scene, when Deng opened up China in the late 1970s. But what then started to happen was China growing and becoming relevant to the China, like the China it is today. So when, as part of the U.S. opening up to China in 1979, in 1980, the U.S. changed, took advantage of a feature of U.S. trade law, which in general would classify non-market economies as being non-normal trade relations, or if you're old enough, non-MFN. MFN meant most favored nation. Actually, they changed the phrase during this period. Clinton changes this phrase when he wants to think of PNTR passed. So if you're a non-market economy, you basically get very high U.S. tariffs. U.S. tariffs are 2 columns, column 1 and column 2. You can also think about it as the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, if you know U.S. economic history. Very, very high tariffs across the board. Then there's another column, which is MFN, or normal trade relation tariffs. And those are generally lower. And the whole post-war period, the Tokyo round, the Uruguay round, all of those were reducing in the United States and other countries the MFN tariffs versus those very high tariffs. So in 1980, as part of U.S. warming relations with China, they established a temporary normal trade relations regime. What did that mean? It meant that the president could ask, and as long as Congress didn't vote against it, China would be given on an annual basis access to the normal trade relations tariffs. And so that happens in the 1980s. It's not controversial at all. The president keeps asking, the Congress says yes. It doesn't get controversial until Tiananmen in 1989. And that was the first time when Congress, actually the House voted no, but the Senate voted yes, and so it carried. But that's when the votes became contentious, and then all during the 1990s, now as China is also growing, there's this temporary, so China is every year getting the same tariffs that the most favored nations that the U.S. trades with, getting those low tariffs. And when you go from 2000 to 2001, there's no change in tariffs. So it's not like all of a sudden the change in regime was low tariffs on China and imports flowed in. What happened instead was they got rid of the need to have those annual reviews. And so now China is permanent. Of course, it's not permanent because then Trump got elected. All of a sudden, permanent doesn't mean permanent. So, okay, but at least until before Trump, this kind of effectively eliminated the possibility that what would a firm be scared of? You would like to be closer to China. You might like to either find a supplier in China, or have an investment in China and bring parts back. But you're not going to engage in that sunk cost if you're worried that the Congress isn't going to go along with this next year if there's some kind of trade war. So there's an option value of waiting. That option value of waiting goes away, right? So tariffs stay exactly the same, but imports surge. And that surging is the kind of deeper integration that happens between the U.S. and China as a result of removing that uncertainty. Okay, so that policy changes, right? And that gives us a way of identifying exposure. It's not any actual change in tariff. It's the what would the increase in tariffs have been, right? How much of an incentive did you have to wait, or how important was it for you to like wait for this policy to become permanent? Can be measured as the difference between the MFN tariff you would get year to year and what it would revert to, right? If the vote kind of went against China. So we call that the NTR gap. It's the gap between the non-NTR rate, the Smoot-Hawley tariff rate, which is generally very large, but not universally large, and the actual MFN rate at the time.
Why do you use this rather than the auto thing?
Because the other thing doesn't have I showed you the time graph. Like, it's very clear it happens in 2000. So this is very amenable, I think, to a different data.
It's just because you think the action was because of this?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's hard. Okay, so I will say yes, I do, but I'm biased, so you can take that with a grain of salt. However, I recognize that this happened when China joins the WTO. When China joins the WTO, they also do changes in their own policy. They remove some export licensing restrictions, they remove import tariffs. So in the first paper where we use the gap, and in this paper, we throw in whatever controls we can for those other things. I don't know whether we can separately identify the effect of being in the WTO versus PNTR, right? So if you believe the covariance we've controlled for Chinese changes in policy. But there could be a halo effect about being in the WTO that is hard to distinguish from this effect. But I do think, ADH does these two different 10-year changes on top of each other. And they have changes going on in both periods. All the action is in their second period. So I think most of what they're catching is this. And to be fair, they mentioned the WTO in the instructions. But this gives us a way, they then infer it from the changes in imports, which that has complications in terms of measuring that right and making sure it's not a correlated demand shock across countries, whereas we can just point to a policy. And I will say that if you compare our and their measure across industries, they're not perfectly overlapping. So we are just Okay. It was a very stressful paper to write because ADH came out right when we were writing the paper. Yeah. So we thought we were done, but I don't know. We weren't done because I think I liked it. I mean, obviously I like it so bad. I should be careful because I'm making film. cut this part out.
Maybe you could look at the correlation between the two measures.
Yeah. So we've done that, they've done that, other papers have done that. I think clearly there's both things going on. Yeah, both things are contributing. Another approach would be to do some kind of instrumental variables where you use, our things. People have done that. I don't know, I've always just liked the reduced one. Okay. All right, so 2 dimensions of exposure. I've already given you I'm going to show you some data in a second, but the industry one is just what I showed you. At any given level industry I, right, it's just a change, it's just a difference between these two numbers. But you should think of I here as being I in manufacturing, right? Because this comes from the tariff code, and there are no tariffs on services. So there's nothing there. So we're going to basically assume you're not exposed or your exposure is, in the next thing I'm going to assume the exposure for non-manufacturing is 0. Okay, so that's the industry one. Sorry, that's the industry one. What's the county one? So the gap at county C is a typical Bartik kind of instrument. I'm going to use the employment weighted share from some earlier year. I'll do 1990, right? At the county level, another difference between us is we've used counties and PDH used commuting zones. So there's 3,000 counties and there's 781 commuting zones. And the reason we like counties is because it gives a bit more variation in what's going on. And we think, so I think the optimal thing is probably somewhere between those two. Anyway, you can do everything that we do with commuting zones. It doesn't change much. But this gives us a bit more precision. Okay, so this is like a initial labor share weighted NTR gap across all of the industries in a county, where we plug in 0 if you're a non-manufacturing industry. You might be a little worried about that, right? Because then counties that have more manufacturing as opposed to less manufacturing will get more numbers filled in. So what we're going to do is separately in the regressions control for the manufacturing share of the county, because you want to think about this as being driven by this policy as opposed to just the fact that counties with manufacturing are somehow different. So that's the way we kind of deal with that control. Kovac has a couple papers about that, for example. Okay, so what do they look like? The dashed one is across manufacturing industries, and you can see that there are some where the gap is huge, right? Where the tariff jump would have been 80 percentage points if Congress had voted no or the president had said no. And then there's some that are very close, and it's exactly that variation across industries that's helpful for us. And then at the counties, that distribution is bunched up much more towards zero. Why is that? Well, it turns out, as you know, manufacturing is a relatively small part of the economy compared to non-manufacturing. So most of the values that go into that average are zero, unless you have a manufacturing sector. And then depending on how many manufacturing industries you have and how big the gap is, you can get a larger number. And so there's a decent amount of variation at the county level as well, right? And so we're going to exploit both of these measures looking at outcomes. Good. Good out that. Okay. So, as I said, we have 19 states for 93 to 2014. And so what are we going to do? What we're going to do is to make it a bit easier to run all the regressions in real time, we're going to take what's traditional in the LHC literature, take a 5% extract, stratified extract. And so we're going to do that, but kick out workers who might be hit retirement age before the end of our sample, because we don't want it to be driven by workers leaving. So we're going to lose you if you're 64 in 2014, or if you're 50, if you're over 50 in 2000, you're not in the sample. We could look at outcomes that vary by age, and we will do that in the next version of the graph, but we're always going to be comparing workers that are like under 50 to workers that are much more. All right. So that gives us about 1 million workers. It gives us about 200,000 firms. And it comes out about, right, it's about 20% of the workers are initially at M firms. That's a typo. It should be M establishments. Okay? And 80% are M establishments. I think in the...
So there's no, so in 2000 in Mexico, the EU trade agreement was ratified. So there's no trade diversion going through Mexico and say US also to Mexico to export to the EU to Mexico. I'm wondering where.
It's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if Hala has a paper.
I'm just wondering whether there's anything going in Mexico that contributed to 2000 being sharp.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. I checked. I don't know if there's anything we can do about it, but like, there is someone who's had several papers on how Mexico was affected both by the latest one of Trump tariffs, but also the PMTR. And I don't remember exactly, but I could look at it. Okay. All right. So we also create two different samples. We're going to call them high tenure and low tenure. So why create them and what are they? We're thinking of tenure as describing the amount of time you spend with a firm. So the high tenure sample is going to restrict the sample to workers that were employed by the same firm continuously over the entire pre-period. So we think of those workers as like having a lot of human capital associated with the firm, more likely to have more human capital at the firm. Compared to who? Compared to low tenure workers. And those are workers that we're still going to require that you were employed in the whole pre-period, but you don't necessarily have to have been at the same firm. And what we're trying to get at here is, remember, like we have this kind of lurking question in the background: is the spatial thing that we're finding a labor market competition story, or is it a demand story? And so we're thinking if we have different kinds of samples like this, we might get at what you were asking, which is which workers are more likely to churn. And maybe those are the workers that on the margin get displaced by the manufacturing workers when they come down or not. So we haven't done a whole lot with that other than create these two different samples. So I'll show you that most of the time they behave similarly, but this low tenure non-manufacturing worker sample actually behaves a bit differently than the others. So I'll show you that as well. Okay, so the important thing to keep in mind is all the samples have workers that were employed that whole period. The reason we could have another sample, which is maybe you weren't employed in the whole pre-period, but you have to be employed in the last year, let's say, because we need to know what industry you're in order to know where you're affected, how you're affected. But then once we started thinking about that, we realized, well, if you're bouncing back and forth between N and N, during that whole pre-period, it's not obvious how you were affected in the same way, like, right, as discreetly as if you were employed in the same firm, for example, which implies that you're employed in the same, generally they almost none of them switch industries. And so then they're really treated by the shop. Anyway, so we're open to thoughts about different samples. That might be interesting to look at. Okay, good on the samples? All right, so just some descriptive statistics. First column is manufacturing workers in the last year of the pre-period, which is 1999. And if you compare them to the non-manufacturing workers, they're a little bit less likely to be female, a bit more likely to be, less likely to be female, less likely to be American-born, and a bit less educated than non-manufacturing workers. And so what do we observe? We observe your gender, then we observe these racial categories. You can be white or non-white. We also observe Asian, but we focus on white, non-white. You can be American-born or not. You can have one of 4 different educational attainment states: less than high school, some college or more. We know your age and we know your earnings. Okay, so you can kind of look at the comparison there, and then we do the same thing for the low tenure sample. So high tenure workers, kind of the biggest difference is you see they get relatively higher wages in our representative sample than if you're low tenure. That kind of makes sense. It could be selection, it could be, but it does make sense. Okay. So, all right. So now comes the controversial part. What do you do with the zeros? And I don't know. This arc sign. You guys familiar with this arc sign transformation? Has become popular, but now has become under attack. So I've been reading up a lot about this. Actually, it's much more interesting than I ever thought. It's like a lot of things. You think it's not interesting, and then you start reading about it. Oh, that's really interesting. So, what's the problem? We have zeros and non-zeros. Now, in a lot of contexts, like whether you patent or not, you don't really care. So you just want to deal with the nuisance. But in our case, zero, non-zero is kind of interesting. Because zero means you lost your job, right? Or you chose to give it up, whatever. You're not employed. And then non-zero means you haven't earned earnings. So in the new draft, so in the draft that I've given you, in this draft, all we've disclosed was this arc sign transformation. What's the arc sign transformation? It's this. But what is it really? It's a way of combining those intensive and extensive margin. Extensive margin is did your earnings go to zero? Did you lose your job? Intensive margin is conditional on remaining employed. What happened to your wages? So actually, I can run separate regressions. I could run a linear probability model with earnings greater than zero as a dummy, and that would be like an employment regression. And then I can run a log regression, which says conditional on earnings, what happened to your wages? And I think in the future graph, we're going to report all 3. What did we do here? We did this thing which combines them, but the reason this is a problem is because it combines them in a scale-dependent way. Again, for our, like in our context, I think actually just adding 1 might be fine, like earnings plus 1, because we just care like how far your earnings are down. Anyway, so we're still playing around with all that. We thought this was great, and then it turns out it's not great. People push back on it. So I don't know, any arc sign experts in the room might be happy to hear what you think. So I'm going to show you this. I'm going to act as if the thing that the coefficient is our elasticities. That's probably problematic. But I will tell you that if I do things the other ways I just mentioned, the story that emerges is always the same. It's just a question of like exactly how much did earnings fall or whatever that we want to put in that. So in a future draft, we'll have a less sloppy way of doing this. Okay, so that's going to be our transformation. I'm not going to show you these today. I have them, they're in the paper, but they're not in the presentation. Just because I already have too many results, I think. I don't want to bombard you with them. Okay, it's very simple regression. I'm going to have that arc sign earnings on the left-hand side. And then I'm going to have industry exposure multiplied typical diff and diff. Post is after the change in policy. I'm going to have county exposure. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to interact post with all those worker attributes. So they're going to break at the same time. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the firm attributes. What are the firm attributes? I didn't show you them. Whether the firm's diversified, the size of the firm, whether the firm trades, etc. Then I already told you I'm going to control for the manufacturing share of the county. That's important to do. And then I have the standard fixed effects you need. It's a worker level regression. So it's worker J. You don't have to pay attention to the footnote, I mean to the subscripts really, but worker J working for firm I at the end of the pre-period in industry firm F, industry I, county C, and year T. And then I'm only gonna show you these results. And then first I'm gonna do something we're gonna call the direct specification. That's this one. And relative to the introduction I gave you, I'm only showing you own county and own industry exposure. Right? So own industry exposure is if you work in an industry where that gap is high. Own county exposure, if that's higher, it means you work in a county where maybe you weren't in the industry that was highly exposed, but you're in a labor market where a lot of your labor market participants are highly exposed. Okay. Simple table. So just the two coefficients of interest, that's in the first panel. Then a bunch of regression information, that's in the second and third panels. Tell you what sample we're looking at, that's in the penultimate sample. And then a kind of standard interquartile kind of elasticity, interquartile how are you affected computation in the last panel. So first column is high tenure manufacturing, second column is high tenure non-manufacturing. And that cell is blank because if you're in non-manufacturing, you don't have an industry gap. Okay? So what do you see? So county exposure lights up, similar magnitude for both groups. That initially grabbed us as interesting. Non-manufacturing workers initial non-manufacturing workers look just as affected as initial manufacturing workers. And then that points to either this aggregate income story or this labor market story. If you take those coefficients, you multiply it by an interquartile change in county exposure, you get these numbers at the bottom, which is in the post period, relatively speaking, your wages are 28% lower because you go from a 25th percentile exposure to a 75th percentile exposure. So sizable effect. So that's one of the main results about that suggests the spatial friction is important. What about industry exposure? Well, in the manufacturing sample, it doesn't light up. Right? So it doesn't, controlling for your industry, it doesn't look as if, controlling for your county, it doesn't look as if your industry affects you one way or the other. Again, pointing to that spatial story as opposed to the industry story. Okay, good. So first result, interesting. Horse race between these two points us towards the spatial things. And then second big message, symmetry between non-manufacturing and manufacturing. So relative, if you go back to that complicated set of slides I showed you with all the literature in it, we're finding, I could show you the employment regression, we find big employment effects in M and NM, and we find big wage effects. So we're not like any of the papers that were up there. Right? We find both effects in both centers. Okay. And then here's the result for the non-manufacturing sample. The low tenure sample. These are the ones that didn't have to be employed by the same firm. And they're roughly similar. I don't want to bombard you with two numbers, but if you look at the two M groups, this is high tenure M, low tenure M. They're similar. The big difference, I don't want to make too much of it because I'm about to say that there's a better specification than this one. So I don't want to make too much of it. But when you look at it this way, that group does seem to have stand out. Right? So the low tenure non-manufacturing, those might be the high turnover. These are the constantly changing firms. They don't have a lot of human capital at firm level. Maybe they are the group of workers in the labor market that are most at risk. So when a bunch of manufacturing workers get displaced, maybe those manufacturing workers look relatively attractive to the firms that might usually hire these guys. And so their competition drives them, their wage down. Or they tend to work in restaurants. And when the county gets hit, people stop going out to eat, and so their earnings fall. Again, I'm not sure how to distinguish between the two stories. Okay. You can do the again with this. This is easy with the single dimension of exposure. I can show you the standard. I use post now. I just do a bunch of year dummies, and you see a pretty clear effect. Right now, admittedly, I've required workers. I've done. These are not just a random draw of workers. These are workers that had to be employed during this period. So this is really particularly sharp. But it is a different diff. So it's comparing that same constraint across the two different kinds of counties. Or whatever, continuously across the counties based on their treatment.
That is surprising. I thought it would be accumulating. So you have a shock in 1 year and then.
Yeah, remember the employment falls really fast. Right? So it falls 3.5 million in a year and a half. So yeah, then, I mean, something we haven't done a lot yet is, if I go back to the linear probability model, I could just ask, what's your likelihood of being not employed, conditional on exposure. But I could do other things. I was looking for what other papers in the literature might have done. I could ask, did you face long spells? Did you face at least 2 years of zero, 3 years of zero, 4 years of zero? If you do that, you find that there are workers that get knocked out for big chunks of time. So yeah, I think that's why.
It was 3 million people in 1 year.
It was. No, here. Yeah. So, 3 million between, this is 19.5 million, and you get down to, I think, just about 17. So 2.5 million over 20 years. Right?
But from 2000 to 2001, it was 3 million.
Yeah, 2, 3. I mean, this period is 2000 to 2003 is about here. So 3 years is 3 million. But it's pretty fast initially. So I think in the first year, it's more than 1 million. So.
And you never said the industries. What were the industries that are the same industries?
Oh yeah, we didn't focus. The other paper we did is at the industry level, and so we kind of focused more on.
In terms of magnitude,
they are the ones. So
textiles.
They are the ones. No. Well, I mean, yeah, but they're the ones that have the high gaps. So the high gap is okay. So the high gap is correlated, weakly correlated with the capital intensity of the industry. But the thing is, you have some textiles. Let's take a sector you might think is a comparative disadvantaged sector. Some of them have high gaps and some of them have low gaps. And so what matters is the gap, as opposed to the particular Pectorolin kind of comparative advantage. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I didn't like in the other paper. It happens at the industry level, and that's where I make the point. Yeah, short answer to your question is yes. I could produce a bar graph with like 3-digit names, manufacturing sectors, and show you where the decline is. Right. But the reason I don't do that is because the point is it's correlated with the exposure. That's really the thing that's that makes sense. Okay. There is an interesting thing that goes on here. I'm curious to what you guys might think about it. I'm not going to tell you about it though, because I'm rewriting the paper and I realize there might be an error in this figure. So there is one group of the 4 groups where the bars after the Great Recession go up. I don't know this. I think this one is wrong because I don't think it's the low tenure end guys. I think I screwed up the code when I was making the figure. But there is one group, and I think the interpretation of it for that group is that it's not that they did better. It's that when the Great Recession came out, everybody else did worse, right? And so they look like they did better. Anyway, I shouldn't even mention it. But the purpose of this is to show you can do a standard kind of year see something dramatic. Okay, now the main results, and then we'll be almost done. As I motivated earlier in the paper, there are if you stop the paper here, it's kind of this negative thing, which is like a lot of the China shop papers is always negative. There had to be a benefit, and so there's different papers trying to find where the benefit might be. Feature has a couple. Maybe they exported more. I don't know, but nothing really. You would think that this should be a big boom, and I agree with the example that was brought up earlier. Companies like Apple might have had a tremendous gain. Prices dropped, etc. But you'd expect to see it somewhere, right? And so the way we're going to try to get at that in this paper, focused on the same thing that the China shop papers do, rather than look at prices and stuff, is to look at whether exposure matters when it's owing up or down. So we can compute upstream industry exposure. It's straightforward. The upstream exposure in industry I is a weighted sum of the exposures among all the industries K that supply I, okay, where that W is just the rate you get to the input application. Likewise, a county has high upstream exposure, if the industries that the county produces a lot of have high exposure upstream to the supplier industries. Okay, so there's an industry version of this upstream and there's a county version of this upstream. Everybody good on that? Okay. All right. Well, you might wonder what they look like. Okay, so here's a scatter plot using 3-digit NAICSs except for 54 because there's no interest in 3-digit and 54. Everything is a 4-digit. The lighter colors are manufacturing. The darker colors are outside manufacturing. And what am I doing here? I'm giving you a scatter of the downstream gap against the upstream gap. Okay, so let's look at some examples. 622, it's almost zero downstream gap. That makes sense because it sells to local residents, not other industries, and it has high upstream gap for the reasons I told you earlier. 5417 is energy sector. Those are R&D labs. And you can see R&D labs, right? They have high upstream exposure and high downstream exposure. That kind of makes sense. Upstream, they buy lots of equipment, and supplies that might be used to run experiments, and downstream, they sell their services to, let's say, manufacturing. Okay. Textiles is down here, has very high upstream. This was the whole point of our, remember the quality paper, right? So textiles has high upstream exposure and high downstream exposure. And so the IO specification, the input-output specification that we're going to run next is going to have 6 measures of exposure, 3 for industry, 3 for county, own up and down. Okay? And it's going to be exploiting this kind of variation that you see in this kind of. All right. This is at the county level. And so county codes aren't going to be natural even for me, they're not natural. So the county code is a mixture of the state and the county in the state. But I'm going to point attention to 2 counties that are going to be interesting. I gave this talk at Santa Cruz a couple weeks ago, so I picked 2 California counties. But then I realized the whole world knows about California. So I have Napa, which you've probably heard of, certainly in Argentina, and then San Mateo, which you've also heard of, which is Silicon Valley. Okay, so 2 different counties in California. Napa, what does Napa produce? Produces wine. Okay, wine uses glass. Glass comes from China. So they have upstream exposure in their manufacturing. But even more importantly, Napa is a tourist destination, right? Which has high upstream exposure because you use things like tablecloths and glassware, and cutlery, and all that.
Already exports out of China too.
Sorry?
Already exports out of China too.
Exports what to the?
Wine.
Oh, yeah. But I'm thinking, just think about the upstream exposure now. So there's a lot of services in Napa. If you've been to Napa, I mean, it's probably like visiting the wine region here. There's a lot of services that use goods that might have benefited from fair competition one way or another. And then you have Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley stands out. I've never been to Silicon Valley, but what is in Silicon Valley is a bunch of tech firms. There's still a bunch of manufacturing firms, high-end, right? But those sectors in Silicon Valley, they don't have as high upstream exposure, and they have more downstream exposure. So I can, at the industry level, I could compare, hospitals to like textiles, and at the county level, and county exposure is, you already know, is going to be the more important measure of exposure. It's the spatial one. I can compare. I'm going to show you something for Silicon Valley versus Napa to bring the figures to life. Okay. So and another thing I'm going to point out is that these things are correlated, and now that presents a problem. Why is it a problem? So in the thing I showed you before, we had one dimension of exposure for county and one dimension for industry. Only the county one was relevant, and so I did the normal interquartile experiment for economic significance. Now economic significance is much more difficult. What is an interquartile change in the 3 different exposures for industry and county? Because they're not independent. I can't just say do 25, 75 in all 3 dimensions. So our strategy is going to be, rather than do that kind of economic significance, I'm going to take the coefficients that come out of the regressions I'm going to show you, and I'm going to reduce them to one number for every county, or let's say for every industry, predicting, using the regression coefficient, what the effect would be for actual industries, or what I'm going to show you today is for actual counties. So I'm planting the seed for you in a minute. I'm going to show you the regression coefficients. Okay, but then I want to demonstrate, well, how do I bring them to life? How do I show you that the regression coefficients imply something interesting about hospitals or Napa versus San Mateo? What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the actual own up and down, multiply them by the coefficients, and just show you the distribution of predicted county effects. So we look a little blank about that, so maybe it'll make more sense in a second. Okay. That was the first time I tried explaining it ahead of time.
It's already almost
Yes, I'm almost done. Yeah. I need 5 minutes. Okay. So same kind of regressions. I'm not going to dwell on them very much. Same setup of the panels. I have industry exposures, I have county exposures. Industry exposures tend not to be significant. County exposures tend to be significant, so that message is the same. The coloring is red, bad, green, good. Okay? So own exposure, negative. Downstream exposure, negative. Upstream exposure, positive. There's some interesting differences in terms of the sign pattern. And so rather than dwell on it, let me give you like an interpretation. Upstream seems more important for non-manufacturing than it does for manufacturing. I gave you a motivation for that with healthcare. But like, why wouldn't it work within manufacturing? Why doesn't upstream, why wouldn't it help as much? Why wouldn't it contribute as much? And I think the answer is that in manufacturing, if you think about like some of the theoretical papers on supply chains, like the bulb and venables, what happens is that one link of the supply chain may not move offshore. What might happen is a whole group of, like a whole bunch of links might move offshore together. So the whole apparel textile sector kind of goes offshore. And if that's the case, you're a given manufacturing industry and you have high upstream, you have high upstream exposure, but your downstream exposure is also high. The whole thing might leave to stay together, and there's all that work on agglomeration and manufacturing services. So I'm not going to go through all the numbers and everything, but there's that difference between manufacturing and non-manufacturing, and I think that might be the explanation for it, although we'd like some more direct evidence for that. Maybe what you're suggesting is good, which is we look at the industries that got hit, and you ask, which ones were you disproportionately more likely to move offshore? And then you ask, are those the ones that had a strong link? That might be the way to do that. Okay, so I'm going to get.
So what were the difference between the two columns?
Manufacturing workers, non-manufacturing workers. Okay, so they don't have any own exposure, industry level. And then they both have negative, positive, negative. But the magnitude for upstream in non-manufacturing is much bigger, and also more stars. Right? So the upstream exposure, and then you're going to see in a minute that coefficient is enough that when I make predictions for every county using the regression coefficients, that's going to overwhelm. When I multiply this for counties by their actual exposure upstream, and this by their actual own exposure, and this by their actual downstream exposure, that's going to overwhelm these two, and the whole thing is going to be really positive. So I'm about to show you that now, and that's the concluding figure.
Why do you think that upstream impact in manufacturing is not significant?
Yeah, so I think the reason it's positive, not significant. I think it relates to the fact that in outside manufacturing, like a hospital, it can't move offshore, right? Because the customers are local; they tend to be local. In manufacturing, the thing is, think about like a cluster of activity that has buttons and textiles and sewing and garment production, right? They're all kind of linked. It's all helpful if they're all located together. And when a significant portion of that chain, but maybe not the whole portion of the chain, gets hit, the whole thing just moves offshore. So they like to stay together. So that's a hypothesis. I don't have direct evidence of that, but I can appeal to the models that say, like this bulb and venables model, that says if you hit like one link particularly hard, the links around it might all go offshore. So that's why I think, but I'd like more direct evidence. Does that make sense?
Peter, it's surprising that in non-manufacturing, if non-manufacturing is non-tradable, all the effect of absorption or whatever it's increasing, it has to be because it has lower input prices. They can lower their prices, and there is some demand elasticity that. Because I'm in a hospital, I'm 5% cheaper, there is more demand for hospital services.
Yeah.
But one would expect that this effect is small. Like the effect one would think is strong would be tradable activity. Tradable even to maybe to some other
because
countries.
You can magnify it by selling
you can
it everywhere.
magnify, exactly. But maybe they can, I don't know if this non-manufacturing is something that you can sell to other countries. I have hospitals, I'm strong in hospitals, and I usually sell hospital services to other countries surrounding me, and I'm disproportionately benefited as a
Yeah.
county
Yeah.
because I'm the hospital county.
Yeah.
And there are lots of now hospital machines that are cheaper.
Sorry, but related, actually related with this question. No manufacturing includes agriculture.
Don't think of it as including agriculture because these data are not great for agriculture.
Okay. Because it's tradable. But
yeah, but I mean services are tradable too.
But
So if you're like an
tradable,
engineering
software
firm,
services are tradable.
R&D labs, hospitals doesn't fit. The one I used to motivate doesn't fit.
But you could separate these.
I could do that. Yeah, I could do the ones that
trade
truly have to be local.
manufacturing and non-tradable.
That's a good idea.
Sorry, because
And then you expect a bigger effect in the one that's tradable for the reasons that you mentioned.
sorry, because I missed this is a question. You also surely you mentioned it like 20 slides before. But, these are non-manufacturing and manufacturing workers. In which year? At the initial.
At the change in policy.
At the change in policy. So
1999.
Okay.
And the shock occurs in 2000.
Okay. So this shock is like instant because, I mean, some of the workers that were manufacturing workers at the beginning could end up as non-manufacturing workers.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
So this upstream and downstream is like we assume that this is an instance that the effect is instantaneous. I don't know.
Yeah, and I would
just to understand because it could develop through the years.
It could.
This effect.
So because of this is being estimated as a post, I'm thinking all the reactions you just mentioned could happen. You might stay at your firm for a little bit and your earnings climb, then you might move to a sector. And so this is just capturing the all-in effect of whatever it is that you get. So another way to think about another outcome that we could put up there is something about your movement. Or are you more likely to have changed the sector, or are you more likely to have changed the plan? So we haven't yet run those on. But you're right, this is a mix of a bunch of different things. Maybe, some of the wage happens conditional on remaining in manufacturing, but other contributions are if you left manufacturing and went to 56 and became an outsourced manufacturer, then you're ready to find that in there too. Okay, good on the coefficients. I'm going to just speed through those. Okay, I already tried to explain this to you, which is I can't do these things like an interquartile change in county exposure going up and down. I can't do that and add them all up because they're not independent, right? The fingers are correlated, but it's 3 dimensions. So how do you pick an interquartile range in 3 dimensions? So we don't do that. What we do instead is, for the model I showed you that only has own, I'm going to focus on counties because counties is where all the action is. In the census, I can do this for every worker, right? But outside the census, I can't. So for every county, I can predict what the earnings effect is using the coefficient and their actual exposure. And then for the second specification, I can also predict for every county, just using the regression coefficients, multiply the betas I showed you, the red and green ones, by the actual exposures. And then I can compare what these 2 models tell us. And that's what I'm going to show you. And that's kind of the end of the definition. Okay? So I'm ignoring all the other covariates, etc. I can do this at the county industry level by using all 6 coefficients. Nothing really changes that much, so I'm just going to make it simple. Okay, so for example, this was always the first column in the regression, manufacturing high tenure. Remember that coefficient for the county was negative, -3. So every county is predicted to be negative because the coefficient is negative. Doesn't matter what the exposure is, all the exposures are positive, you're going to be negative, right? You're going to be bounded at 0, and that was this kind of negative, there's no pro-competitive effect. That's the regression I want. Then what's the blue one? The blue one says use the second regression I showed you with the 3 different exposures for county. And now what do you see? Well, it looks roughly the same, but there are some counties that actually have a relative gain in earnings, predicted relative gain. Why? Because for some counties, the upstream exposure was positive enough that it overcomes the negative. Okay, but it's not overwhelming. It's definitely, there's something there, but it's not overwhelming. Okay, now do it for all 4 samples. And what do you see? So again, this is M is the first column, NM is the second column. These are the guys always employed by the same firm. These are the guys allowed to change firms. Probably we could get rid of these guys because it's too much information. But what do you see? Definite difference now. Outside manufacturing, those blue distributions, the solid lines, are generally positive. They're, for 90% of counties, they're positive here, relatively speaking. And it's about 70% here. And so that's the source of that motivation I gave you, that message I gave you, which is if you allow for the fuller range of exposure along the value chain outside manufacturing, that's like that they're relative gain. Right? And I don't know what the absolute gain is, but whether it's even an absolute gain, but they're definitely relative gain. And it comes from that positive coefficient that was green. And then Juan Carlos is a good point, which is if I separate this out more by the ones that can trade their services or not, they might be more advantaged to take advantage of the positive shock, and maybe they benefit more. So I'll do that. Okay, so that's the main message of the paper. Last slide I'll show you is I can do something similar at the county level. So all of these were all two different distributions of the first specification with no upstream downstream, second specification with them. I can just give you a scatter of these 2 points on top of each other. And then you'll see things like where Napa and Silicon Valley show up. And again, what you find is, if you look across counties, it's kind of fun and interesting because Napa benefits in a way that Silicon Valley doesn't. Why? Because Napa has those industries that have pretty high upstream exposure. But the very first question you asked in the back, one thing we're probably not capturing here is that in Silicon Valley, San Mateo, it'd be interesting to try to figure out how to go back and look at the residuals of all this stuff. Because in Silicon Valley, whole new kinds of companies could have come into being that weren't possible before. We can't catch that, remember, because we're looking at workers that are continuously employed. We could look at firms that are continuously employing. What we really want to know is how to identify the firms that were able to do something that they couldn't do before. So that's been an interesting challenge that I work on. I don't know if we'll solve it in this paper, but we're trying to work on it. Okay, so anyway, I took you over. I apologize for that. What did we conclude so far? So we revisit the China shock. What happens if you use individual level data, and you're able to control for more of the things that might be hidden under the hood in a regional analysis or an industry analysis. We find that exposure matters both in terms of county versus industry and in terms of upstream versus owning downstream. It leads to some interesting results that still need to be explained, like why is it the upstream effect as important in manufacturing as it is outside manufacturing? That's an interesting thing to keep thinking about. We have this lurking question we'd like to know more about the labor market effect as opposed to the demand effect inside counties, all of which we'll keep looking at.